I see. Scientists. I love it. Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Going, and probably already gone. This is the state of Ukraine's sovereignty. As the Western-backed and unelected regime in Kiev continues its military operations against Eastern protesters, all Ukrainians are being asked to participate in a presidential election. There is scant evidence it will be legitimate. To crosstalk the crisis in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Sarah Lyon in London. She is a research fellow from the Royal United Services Institute. In New York, we have Caleb Maupin. He is a journalist and political analyst. And in Washington, we cross to Robert Perry. He's an investigative reporter who now edits the online news site, consortiumnews.com. All right, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Robert, if I can go to you first in Washington, there's going to be a presidential election of sorts in Ukraine this Sunday on the 25th of this month here. It looks like there's going to be a choice between Coke and Pepsi because the flavor that is recognized and preferred in the East isn't going to get much of a hearing if even these people are going to vote in this election.
Well, that's right. There's been efforts in the East to declare independence, to separate from Ukraine, and those provinces have indicated they do not want the elections to go forward. However, it does appear that the oligarch Poroshenko has the most likely chance of winning, and I'm told that that's not entirely a negative as far as both Russia and some in the United States view it. They see him as a possible compromise candidate, someone who could work with both sides, even though he's spoken very strongly about joining the European Union and being part of that. He also has shown some willingness to work with the Russians, and I'm told that President Putin sees him as a possible person that could bring the country together.
Okay, Robert, if I can just stay with you, then why don't you just make him an intermediary? Why does he have to be a Western-anointed president of Ukraine? I mean, I agree with you. If someone can talk to all sides, that's great. But why should there be an election where at least 14% of the population says at this point that they're not going to participate?
Well, there's no question. There's always a problem when you have this kind of conflict and you have problems with people having their votes counted or even voting. But the West has wanted to have some legitimacy added to this new government in Kiev.
This election is going to instill legitimacy on a government that has been installed by the IMF against the will of the Ukrainian people. This government was put in undemocratically with fascist mobs forcing out the elected government. This government has no legitimacy internationally. It simply doesn't under international law. This is not a real government that we have in Kiev right now, and it's unleashed a campaign of horrific fascist terror. Buildings being burned in Odessa, people being beaten down, journalists being harassed and beaten and tortured and kidnapped. All kinds of horrific things are being done, backed up by the United States. This election will only serve to legitimize that government that's been imposed on the Ukrainian people. Okay. The people in Donetsk and Luhansk have voted overwhelmingly not to be part of this new regime. So why should we have an election just to legitimize it?
Sarah, that's a very interesting point here. And this is one of the things I've noticed in Western media, this woof of optimism, if we can just have this election here, because it gets away from exactly what we heard from New York. Caleb saying, you know, this illegal regime in Kiev, because it is an unelected illegal regime, and the West really definitely wants to have something that they can say is legitimate. Unfortunately, it looks like this election isn't going to cut the mustard. It may actually have the opposite effect.
Well, I think Putin himself has said that you know, the elections are a step in the right direction. And the fact is that there is a power vacuum after Yanukovych fled. A government had to form an interim government. It recognises itself it's not the legitimate government, which is why it's holding elections. And I would say that just because the eastern parts of the country would boycott it and don't necessarily want to participate doesn't mean that these are Western-backed elections. And in Crimea, we saw that a large part of the population boycotted those because they did not want to become part of Russia. So I think it works both ways in that sense.
Okay, Caleb, so you can have an election backed by the West, because it's still backed by the West. We have to remember, after the coup, we know from Nuland's leaked conversation, she appointed that government almost to every position. It's really quite remarkable. Or she must be clairvoyant, I don't know. But, you know, you have referenda in the East, it's not recognized, but there's going to be a Kiev-oriented election, and it's called legitimate. That's kind of a hypocrisy.
Well, all over the world, the United States brags about being the champion of democracy. But whenever people may vote against the interests of the United States and against the interests of Wall Street and the bankers, all of a sudden they're not interested in democracy anymore. They discounted the elections in Crimea. They've ignored the referendums in Donetsk and Luhansk. And this is just a pure example of hypocrisy, just like they're trying to prevent Syria from having elections coming up now. Like, whenever elections go on and the U.S. doesn't like the results, they simply ignore them. It's very, very hypocritical. You know, the fact that when these referendums took place in Donetsk, people had to defend the ballots with arms to prevent fascists from the right sector from preventing people from voting. The government in Kiev mobilized the ultra-right to try and prevent people from voting, preventing elections from taking place. But that's actually really similar to what happened in Detroit. In Detroit, a city in the United States, the elected government has been removed and an emergency manager has been put in. Everywhere across the world, we're seeing austerity. Austerity is being imposed, and because people may vote against it or want to oppose it, we're seeing democracy being stripped away. Fascism is being supported in order to champion austerity and to give the banks what they need, so the banks can continue to rule over the rest of us, the working people of this world.
Robert, it seems to me the word legitimacy is what's most important here. And, you know, Sarah is right there. I mean, they are having an election, but you have harassment of all the other the parties that do not support this regime. We have the Communist Party that's being hounded out of the Rada. I mean, how can this be democratic in any sense? You're just getting a choice where no matter what the outcome is, it's what the West wants to live with, because they're the ones that brought this crisis to Ukraine, not the Maidan itself. There was the ample evidence that this was orchestrated, and now they're going to make sure that they have a very limited choice. Again, I can't understand why this election could be considered legitimate if people in the East cannot have a strong candidate, and there isn't one. I mean, there's so much intimidation.
Well, it's true. Some of the East candidates, people like Dobkin, for instance, felt harassed, threatened with arrest. And that's happened with some others. So you do have a very limited election, but in a sense, all elections have some limitations. The election in Crimea, which I think did reflect the will of the people to separate from Ukraine and join Russia, was certainly not a perfect election. It was done hastily, but it did reflect, I think, the broad will of the people of that region. Similarly, in the East, despite problems with those elections, they did reflect the will of the people to have greater independence from Kiev. These elections will certainly be problematic as well, and they will not reflect the full view of the Ukrainian people. But to the degree that they put in place a leader that the different sides can work with, that could end up being helpful in terms of reaching some kind of resolution to this crisis. And I understand that there's now been there's been contacts between Moscow and Washington where there's looks like there will be movement forward to have a more rational approach to Ukraine. Some of the hardliners in Washington have backed away a bit. President Putin seems to have reached out more to President Obama, who has been more responsive to having a pulling back, a toning down of this crisis, and it's maybe leading to a summit on D-Day, the 70th anniversary of D-Day on June 6th. So you're seeing some movement toward not a resolution fully, but at least a dialogue involving these various parties, and to some degree, this very flawed election that's coming up may help advance that.
Okay, Sarah.
But Robert, the FBI and the CIA are on the ground aiding this Kiev government, this illegitimate government, aiding it in its attacks and aiding the violence that are going on. Academy, formerly known as Blackwater, is also on the ground working with this Kiev regime. I don't think this is moving toward peace in any conceivable way, as people are being murdered and killed on the streets in order to uphold this government and put down the people in the East that would revolt against that. I don't see Obama working towards peace as he continues to back back up this regime.
Let me go to Sarah here. I mean, one of the problems here, and I guess we all agree for one reason or another this is going to be a flawed election here, but you have these right-wing militias being directed by the authorities in Kiev to assault. These are military operations against populations in the east. I mean, how in the world can we actually think this is going to be a legitimate election if there's military action against the very people that could possibly be voting or should be voting?
Well, I think the term right-wing has certainly been bandied around and is used for various agendas. I think the Ukrainian government responded to trying to settle things in the east. And if we're going to talk about violence, then I would draw attention to the fact that the elements in the east are certainly using violence. Again, there's reports of torture, there have been deaths, there have been journalists that have been taken hostage or kidnapped and put in rooms, handcuffed. I think there's,
but Sarah,
there's a real risk of branding everything right-wing.
This is what a civil war is all about. You just described it, okay? But where are the legions of militias moving on Kiev from the east? Are there any?
Well, where are the militias moving on the east? I think that it's the Ukrainian army. And there have been reports of
the people in Odessa burned themselves alive
from a government that has been imposed on them by Wall Street. They have the absolute right to stand up for themselves and to fight back against this campaign of terror being unleashed on them. Right-wing forces are moving from the west to the east to go in and attack and burn buildings and murder people, and they are defending themselves. They are defending themselves in their own regions. They are defending themselves from an attack of a horrific campaign of fascist violence, which has been created and funded by our tax dollars, people living in the United States. $5 billion of our tax dollars are going to fund the ultra-right-wing government in the Ukraine. When schools are being closed here in the United States, hospitals are closing. They just cut food stamps by $5 billion. Imagine where that money could go, but instead our tax money is going to fund fascist violence against the people in East Ukraine. We need to stand against this. This attack on the people in East Ukraine, it's an attack on all working people in the world. Everywhere there's mass unemployment,
I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT.
I see. I love it.
Economic reputation has, of course, been changed. Reporting from Tripoli, Syria, China. We'll talk about Russia's role in the global here in Russia from Germany, Korea, Amnisnawe, and Washington. The U.S. is trying to pressure the U.S. president warned of what would happen if the Republicans don't set aside extreme party lines.
We are not talking the language of war, but I will only react to situations.
I have read the reports, but I'm not in a position to...
No, I will leave that to the State Department to comment on your latter point.
I don't want to say that.
Mr. Kerry, do you have any comments on the document? No comment? Thank you.
No more weasel words. When you evade a direct question, be prepared for a chase. When you throw a punch, be ready for a battle.
Freedom of speech means little without the freedom to question.
In his secret laboratory, Tim Kirby was able to build the world's most sophisticated robot, which unfortunately doesn't give a darn about anything. Tim's mission? To teach his creation why it should care about humans and world events. This is Why You Should Care. Watch only on RT.com.
I see. I love it.
Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the crisis in Ukraine. like to go back to Washington. Robert, you were talking about the communication between Washington and Moscow and presumably even Brussels about de-escalation. You didn't use the word de-escalation, but I have to wonder if the train has already left the station. I mean, in many ways, the country is very fractured here. If there are people that are very adamant that they don't want to participate in this political process and actually have their own political process, then it's just a day late and a buck short.
Well, to some degree, that's true. And it is true that the United States and the West generally provoked this crisis. There's been this false narrative that's been used in Washington about this was all some grand scheme that President Putin dreamed up, and it's obviously not the case. He was not the instigator of the Maidan demonstrations. He was not the instigator of these really neo-Nazi militias that did exist, that still do exist. That attacked that began attacking the police in the Maidan, that led to the crisis, that led to the ouster of Yanukovych, who was essentially an ally of Putin. So the idea that this was some kind of grand scheme of Putin's is ridiculous. But that was pushed. There was a seizure of the initiative in Washington by the neoconservative side, by the hardliners, many of them ensconced in the State Department. They pushed this very aggressively, particularly Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland. And it led to the shattering of Ukraine's fragile constitutional system. That is, the ouster of Yanukovych by violence and through extra-legal means. He was not impeached as the Constitution required. Once that happened, that did set in motion what happens in a country like this, where you have strong ethnic differences, where you have historical narratives that conflict between the West and the East. And once the constitutional system is shattered, you get violence, and you get people, you get the kind of problems we've seen. And it is true that that many of these right-wing militias
Robert,
have been incorporated now into the National Guard
and sent to the East. That don't compute is one is saying that Hitler was a great liberator and saying things in praise of Hitler, and the other is anti-fascist.
Well,
these aren't equal. You can't equate those two narratives. One is praising Hitler, and the other is praising the people of the world fighting for democracy.
Let me jump in here. I think that's Robert just said that, just not those exact words. There are very different narratives here. This is one of the biggest problems. Let me go to Sarah in London here. Ever since the advent of the crisis, the real crisis on the Maidan, when the EU walked away from its own deal on the night of February 21st, there's been the idea of some kind of federalization, decentralization. Why aren't we talking more about that now? Why can't that be part of the process? Because Kiev and its backers keep saying no to that, but that is ultimately what the solution will be if you want to keep Ukraine together as a sovereign state. If you don't go down that path, then it can't be fixed. It's broken.
Well, America has said that it would be open to the idea of federalization. And to be honest, I think that potentially is, certainly decentralization is potentially what could help this situation. And Yatsenyuk also came out the other day saying that he was for decentralization, at least. I know he won't be necessarily the leader in the future, but I don't think there's this absolute anti-sentiment towards federalization. I think the situation needs to be contained, and I think dialogue with including Russia, the EU, and whatever government is voted in next week, and including dialogue with people in the East, is the only way to resolve the issue.
Well, Sarah, but I mean, I don't want to be contrarian here, but they already did that. They had an agreement on February 21st. That is what you just said is what they did, and there was a Russian observer. Why did we have to go through all of this? Why did Nuland have to push so hard when there would have been a presidential election in March of next year? Why did this have to happen? It's all done on purpose, and it has done nothing except for break the country. There was an agreement on February 21st, and you want to go back to it? Do you think that's possible?
Well, yeah, there were lots of elements, obviously, that was to diffuse a somewhat different situation, though. And it was complicated by the fact that the president fled the country. Also, I mean, Russia was reluctant to sign. It was witnessed, but it was reluctant to sign the agreement. So it obviously turned to it as something that everyone should be observing and upholding, but wasn't necessarily completely
What about the
on board with it at
culpability
first.
of the European Union, then? Okay, you can leave Russia out of it, okay? What about the culpability of the European Union not to keep its word, to back it up? Because it was a red line here. That's what it was perceived as here. The EU lies.
Well, I don't think it's perceived that way necessarily. I think that the EU was involved in trying to defuse the situation, and then things changed. I think, yes, it may have been it was an error not to try and incorporate that into the new government. But the Ukrainian government have signed the political side of the agreement, and I think the situation changed, and different things needed to be addressed, with things like Crimea coming up and the eastern Ukraine becoming a problem.
Okay, Kyle, you know, for a lot of people, it's very interesting is that you have this regime that is not elected in Kiev, but it did sign the political side of the European Association Agreement, which was quite interesting because it's not representative of any values held in the East, obviously. It does have security concerns tying the country closer to NATO. But, you know, that same government, this illegal government in Kiev, even it won't sign the economic side of it because it knows what it's all about, and it's all about the gross austerity that you just mentioned.
Well, the economic results of this horrendous coup in Ukraine have come down on the people of the whole country. You know, the price of heating oil has doubled. The prices of food are growing very rapidly. There's talk of mass privatizations. The people of Ukraine are really suffering now that this coup, not only did it put fascists into office in the Ukraine, but it also put the control of the Western banks and the corporations into power. Essentially, the right of the people of Ukraine to govern themselves and to make their own economic decisions has been taken away. And it's not just an attack on Ukraine, it's an attack on Russia, on China, on Iran, on Syria, on all countries that are seeking independent economic development. They're being surrounded and threatened because the U.S. bankers want to control the world economy. They don't want independence. They can't tolerate any independent economic development around the world by anyone. And we've seen that. This is the same battle. Every country that we talk about that's in the news, whether it's Syria, and anywhere, it's the same fight. It's Wall Street trying to control the world, and the people of the world desperately trying to throw Wall Street off their backs and to establish independence. Coming up on Monday, there are going to be massive demonstrations here in the United States by working people who are opposed to what's happening in the Ukraine, who are also saying that they want to get rid of Wall Street. Working people in the United States who are having their homes foreclosed, who are seeing a rising police state, they're being threatened by the same Wall Street bankers. The U.S. government is run by Wall Street and the bankers, and the people of the world are fighting against them, just like people here in the United States are fighting against them. It's a global struggle against the power of the Wall Street monopoly imperialists.
Robert, you know, one of the interesting things...
Well, I would just like to say very quickly that...
Go ahead, jump in. It's CrossTalk, Sarah. Please
Russian
do.
Oligarchs...
Please do.
There's a point to the fact that Russian oligarchs control a lot of the City of London. So I think if you're talking about bankers controlling the world, I think, the global economy...
Well, Sarah, all I can say to that,
the oligarchs in the United States that are raining death and destruction on the people of the world.
I want everyone to have fair time, and I want to say to Sarah, touche, okay? Robert in Washington, if I can go to you. What if this process doesn't work out? Because we have Hunter Biden. It didn't make a big splash in Western mainstream. Maybe on your media outlet it did. But there is a kernel, at least, of what we've just heard there. I mean, the body is still bleeding, and corporate America is already there, and it's looking for energy resources in Ukraine as what could seemingly be. Maybe we don't know the definition of it, but maybe a country that's already in civil war. I mean, it's really quite vapid.
Well, that's certainly true. If you remember when Victoria Nuland gave her famous address, where she mentioned that $5 billion had been spent on the so-called European aspirations of Ukraine, this was back in December, she did it at a forum sponsored by Chevron. And there's been clear interest on the part of various energy companies and other companies to move in and scoop up what they can from Ukraine. And of course, that's been going on really for a couple of decades now, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you've seen the privatization of Ukraine, and you've seen the gross inequality of the country, where you have a handful of oligarchs who control a great deal of the wealth and the political power. And you have the widespread suffering and poverty among the average people. And clearly what's happened during this crisis will make things worse for them. And if the IMF plan, which the new government or the interim government pushed through, takes effect, it will make things even worse for the average person in Ukraine. So yes, you have this rather unseemly scramble for the resources of Ukraine as this crisis plays out. But the narrative that I've been sort of following based on my reporting has been that to some degree this was pushed by the neoconservatives and other hardliners who still hold a great deal of power in Washington, and especially in the State Department. This was something that they wanted to do. They've been pushing for this for a long time. There was an article back in September by Carl Gershman, the head of the National Endowment for Democracy, in which he described the efforts to get Ukraine as the biggest prize.
The biggest prize.
And he made clear that behind that was an effort to go after
Robert, I would disagree with you politely. That I would say that imperialism is not a policy. This is something that the bankers and the Wall Street imperialists have to do to maintain their hegemony. It's not about one faction or the other, the neoconservatives versus this other section. It's about what this system has to do to maintain itself.
I'm gonna
Global monopoly capitalism based in the United States cannot allow any competition.
Hang on here. Sarah, I want to give you the last word. I think one of the sad things when you look at Ukraine is that they may have elections, but all those oligarchs, they still stay in place. I think that's the great tragedy of Ukraine.
Well, I think that was a tragedy under Yanukovych when everyone was supporting him and he was very friendly with Russia. I think that is definitely a problem in Ukraine, that you get oligarchs controlling industry, they're controlling media, they're controlling a lot of the business. And I think the very sad thing is that once again, despite revolutions, the Orange Revolution, Yanukovych will.
I wish we had more time. I have to jump in here, Sarah. We've run out of time.
People
Many thanks to my guests in London, New York, and in Washington. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
I'm
Science.
I love it.